Hi guys, and welcome back to this channel. Today we continue speaking about the word order in English, in particular in declarative sentences. If you haven't watched the introduction to this series, you can follow the appropriate link down below. In that first lesson, we spoke about the nature of the English language. We discussed that the word order in English is fixed and that it follows the formula of subject, verb, object. Today we'll be talking in detail about declarative sentences or statements. Let's get down to some formulas. The canonical word order in the declarative sentence in the English language is this: subject, verb, object, and adverbial modifier. Pay attention that object and adverbial modifier are in the brackets. Why? Because you may not have them in your sentence. What you always have in all your English sentences is the verb and the subject. Though in imperative sentences, for example, we don't have the subject. But still, we are not talking about imperative sentences today. Today we are dealing with declarative sentences. So in a statement, in a declarative sentence in English, you will always have the subject and the verb. It's impossible to build a sentence without a subject in English, though it is possible in some synthetic languages. I'll remind you, English is an analytical language, and the word order is very important because it shows us the relationships between words in a sentence. As we don't have any endings, any changes in the words themselves, that will show us what is what. Let's look at the sentences. Adam likes roasted potato. My Uncle James has opened a flower shop. Anna said she would have finished her lesson by 7 p.m. All of these sentences follow the canonical word order, SVO. The third sentence is a complex sentence. It has a main clause, Anna said, and a subordinate clause, she would have finished her lesson by 7. And yet, in each of these clauses, we follow the same canonical word order. The subject takes the first place, the verb takes the second place, then goes the object, and then go adverbial modifiers. Objects may be direct or indirect, and your verb can have two objects at the same time, a direct one and an indirect one. Sometimes your sentence consists only of the subject and the verb. That happens, for example, when your verb is an intransitive verb. For instance, he arrived. The verb to arrive is intransitive, so it doesn't take an object. But in the sentence, he opened the window, to open is a transitive verb. It needs an object. He opened what? A window. So the minimum set of words that makes what you have said a sentence is a subject and a verb. You should have at least these two. Let's look at these examples. Jane writes. This sentence consists of a subject and a verb. Jane writes songs. Here, apart from the subject and the verb, we have an object, songs. Jane is writing a sad song now. We add an adverbial modifier now, and now our sentence has 4 components. Jane is the subject, is writing is the verb, a sad song is an object, and now is an adverbial modifier of time. Jane was writing yesterday. This sentence doesn't have an object, but it does have an adverbial modifier of time, yesterday. And Jane writes her songs in her room. In her room is an adverbial modifier of place. So we have the subject, Jane writes is the verb, her songs is the object, and in her room, answer the question where. It's an adverbial modifier of place. Now let's look at a somewhat different set of examples where we'll have indirect objects. Jane writes to her brother. Jane is the subject, writes is the verb, and her brother here is an indirect object because it is introduced with the help of the particle to. She writes to whom. It's an indirect object. She writes what? Songs. Songs is a direct object. She writes to whom? To her brother. Her brother is an indirect object. Jane writes letters to her brother. Here, both a direct and an indirect objects are present. Jane writes them with a black pen. Again, Jane is the subject. writes is the verb, them is the direct object, and with a black pen is an indirect object. Again, it is introduced with the help of the preposition, so it's an indirect object. Jane writes letters to her brother every week. Jane is the subject, writes is the verb. Again, both a direct and an indirect objects are here, but we also have an adverbial modifier in the end of the sentence. Every week. How often? And the last example, Jane writes about her life in her letters to her brother. Here we have an indirect object about her life. Her life is an indirect object. And in her letters to her brother is an adverbial modifier of place, where, in her letters. So as you see, the first and the second components are always the same. You always have the subject and the verb. The rest may change. You may or may not have objects, you may or may not have adverbial modifiers. If you do have them, objects always follow the verb, and adverbial modifiers are typically in the end of the sentence. Now let's take a look at negative declarative sentences. To make our statement negative, we need not. But we cannot just drop it in there. We cannot say Jane not writes songs. We can only introduce not into our sentence with the help of an auxiliary verb. So you glue the negative particle to the auxiliary verb. You don't add it to the main verb. You don't put it in front of the verb like that. Not writes, yeah? You need an auxiliary verb to hold it. So our word order in a negative statement is this: subject, auxiliary verb plus not, main verb or notion verb, object, direct or indirect, and adverbial modifier. Let's look at several examples. Jane doesn't write. We have the subject. Jane doesn't is the auxiliary verb that shows us that it's the present simple tense, and our subject is third person singular, and write is the main verb. Jane doesn't write songs. Here we have the subject, Jane, the auxiliary verb doesn't, the main verb write, and a direct object, songs. Now, Jane wasn't writing yesterday. It's the past progressive tense, so our auxiliary verb is was. It shows us that it's a past tense and that the doer of the action is third person singular. Jane hasn't written many songs yet. The present perfect tense. Has is the auxiliary verb. That shows us that it's the present perfect tense, and the doer of the action is the third person singular. Jane didn't write to her brother. Now, the object here is indirect. Jane didn't write to whom? To her brother. Did is the auxiliary verb that we use because it's the past simple tense. Jane won't write any letters to her brother. The future simple tense will plus not makes want. Two objects are here. Letters is a direct object, and to her brother is an indirect object. Jane won't have written any letters to her brother by the end of the week. Two auxiliary verbs are here, will and have. We add not to the first of them, won't have. Letters is a direct object. Her brother is an indirect object, and also we have an adverbial modifier by the end of the week. When? By the end of the week. Auxiliary verbs don't have their lexical meaning. They may have a functional or a grammatical meaning. The term auxiliary verb came from Latin, from the word auxilium, help. These verbs help us understand where we are on the timeline. Are we in the present, or in the past, or in the future? And they also show who the doer of the action is. Is it third person singular? Is it first person? Is it second person? So all that grammatical information is conveyed via the auxiliary verb. Main verbs tell us what actions subjects perform, while auxiliary verbs help main verbs to form their tenses and moods. Jane doesn't write songs. Write. What is this action that Jane performs? She writes. not dances, not sings, but writes. Doesn't, that is does plus not, shows that Jane is third person singular and that the action is in the present simple tense. How many auxiliary verbs are there in English? Many. To be precise, 24. Auxiliary verbs are is, am, are, was, were, has, have, had, do, does, did, will, would, shall, should, can, could, may, might, must, ought, need, dare, and used. You'll probably say that the majority of the words on this list are modal verbs, and you'll be right, but their full name is modal auxiliary verbs. By the way, you can check the series of my lessons on modal verbs. The links are in the description down below. Where do we use these auxiliary verbs apart from negative statements? We use them to form complex tense forms, like they have already arrived, or she passed her exam because she had been studying a lot. We use them to form moods. If I were in your shoes, I would know better. I would rather you stayed at home tonight. You can check my video on the subjunctive mood if you're not sure how these two sentences were formed. We also use auxiliary verbs in emphatic structures, like do come in or he did insult her, I saw it. And of course, we use them to form negative statements and questions. I don't know anyone more stubborn than Michael. They didn't invite Lucy to the wedding, did they? Have you ever been to Las Vegas? Will they ever reconcile? These 24 verbs are also known as anomalous finites. The verbs be, have, do, need, and dare can be used as both auxiliary verbs and main verbs. The rest are always used as auxiliaries. And this is where things get convoluted. Why anomalous finites are important? Well, because they break the SVO rules. Let's look at these statements and questions. Jane wasn't at home yesterday. I'm not your friend. Is she at home now? Am I free to go? Who's here? What happened next? Need I do that again? These sentences do not exactly follow the SVO word order, right? That happens because be, do, need, have, dare can function as both auxiliary verbs and main verbs. They are called finite, from Latin finitus, finished, because their forms are somewhat finished. These verbs follow their own patterns with unique forms for each person, singular and plural, in present and past tenses. And you have to learn those forms by heart. We say, she didn't come with us yesterday. Subject, auxiliary verb plus not, verb, indirect object, adverbial modifier. But we don't say, she didn't be with us yesterday, do we? Of course we don't. Instead, we say, she wasn't with us yesterday. So the formula here is subject, auxiliary verb plus not, indirect object, and adverbial modifier. In this case, the auxiliary verb and the main verb kind of merged together. They take one place because to be is an anomalous finite, and it can function both as an auxiliary verb and as a main notion verb. It doesn't need any additional auxiliaries. It is an auxiliary and a main verb itself. Thus, to form negative statements, we add not to a form of the verb to be and receive am not, is not, and are not in present, and was not and were not in past. I'm not his best friend. He isn't late. They aren't at home now. I wasn't at that exhibition yesterday. He wasn't at the library. They weren't invited to the wedding. To form questions, we put a form of the verb to be in the first place. And in this way, the typical word order SVO is changed. Am I your best friend? Is she an engineer? Was he at the library? Aren't they at home now? And this is what we'll talk about in our next episode. We'll be speaking about different types of questions that we have in English and about those formulas that they follow. If you don't want to miss that part, please follow me and subscribe to this channel. Write your comments down below and see you in the next lesson.